Marie Ellis is a Sunday Times #1 best-selling ghostwriter, freelance editor, and writer of literary fiction. She's also led content strategies at top health publishers and managed content teams to great success. She combines her journalism and acting background with her writing skills to help businesses and individuals tell their stories. Welcome to Notes from a Ghost, a podcast about stories and the people who tell them. My name is Charlie, and I'm a ghostwriter. I love a good story. I hope you enjoy this one. Marie, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with acting. You have, it sounds like a couple of interesting careers before ghostwriting, both of which I would imagine really inform your work as a ghostwriter. But I've heard ghostwriting compared to method acting. And I'd love to know what you think about that. And then just kind of more generally, I want to hear about how acting has influenced your ghostwriting.
Yeah, so I'll start with the method acting one. I'm not a method actor. I ascribe to the kind of sense memory Uta Hagen approach to acting, if anybody out there is an actor. Um, I've never really heard of ghostwriting compared to method acting, but from my experience, it's very similar to acting in that it's like a character that you adopt, and you need to really kind of get into a person's head and understand where they're coming from and what their outlook on life is and what motivates them in order to adopt their voice for ghostwriting. So it being compared to acting definitely resonates for me. It's a skill, lifelong skill that I pull from when I'm ghostwriting. Method acting is an interesting one, though. I'd like to learn more about its comparison to method acting because for me, I think it would be really strange to approach ghostwriting from a method acting lens, and I'm wondering what that would look like. For example, I feel like I would need to live with the person that I'm ghostwriting for if I were if I were approaching it from a method acting lens, and I think they would probably get really sick of me and tell me to get out of their house. But but yeah, the comparison with acting is so similar, and the approach that I take with ghostwriting is really similar to how I've approached characters I've played in the past.
It sounds like, is it fair to say that what we do as ghostwriters is closer to the, um, I don't know if research is the word you use in acting, but like that sort of background that you'll do on a character, um, versus the performance side of it, which I would imagine involves a lot of physicality and things like that that don't really apply to writing.
Sure. Yeah, I think the background approach for me personally is very similar. So when I'm approaching in the past, when I've approached a character that I've played, for me personally in my approach, I really want to understand what there's different approaches actually for some people, and it kind of depends on the play. So I've done, for example, Harold Pinter plays where the everything's there on the page. Even when you're supposed to take a beat, he writes beat in when you're supposed to pause. And when you approach those characters, sometimes you don't even really need to understand their backstory. It's just show up and say the words on the page in the rhythm that Pinter wanted you to say them in, and you're good to go. Get out of the way and let the writing do it. Whereas with most other characters I've played, you want to understand, what has happened before this play started. What are their motivations? What do they really want? What's keeping them from getting it, and why? Um, for me, in order to play a character, I like having that depth of understanding about them. And definitely when I approach writing for somebody else, I really like to understand who they are and what makes them tick. And that helps me get into the rhythm of their voice too. And in that sense, we mentioned earlier, it's not as physical, of course, ghostwriting, but in a way, there are physical elements to it, I think, in terms of, you kind of you need to, like, physically hear the cadence of their voice rattling around your head, and to me, that is kind of physical in a strange way.
So, you've mentioned voice a couple times, and I think that one, it's really interesting how that tends to be one of the first things people want to talk about, or it's kind of, it seems to be, I think the assumption for a lot of people is the real value of a ghostwriter is capturing your voice or putting your voice on the page. Um, and I wonder, because I've just seen from experience that it's people seem to have different ideas about what that actually means. What does it mean to you, and how might you kind of help a client or an author understand that there's some nuance? Because I think like where I've seen it kind of go off the rails is when somebody thinks that like what they mean by their voice is um like, the certain slang they use, or things like that, that at the end of the day are kind of superficial.
Mhm.
um and I often think of voice a little bit more like in the English major sense of the word.
Yes, absolutely. So we all have different voices. The way we write is different from the way we speak. And vice versa. Oftentimes, it's best if when you're writing, even an email, I do this. I don't know if you do, even an email to my parents or a message to my sister, I'll sometimes, if it's a really important meaning I'm trying to convey, I'll read it out loud because I want the message, like the meaning to come through. And sometimes if it's clouded by your own internal voice, your message actually isn't clear. So helping a client understand the nuance between the way they speak, you know, out in the real world, and the way their voice and their meaning needs to be conveyed in a book is different. And had a really interesting potential client call earlier this month, um, which is a man from London, um, who has like a strong Cockney accent, and he asked me, "How can you capture my voice? You're, an American woman, an American sounding woman." Um, and I said, "That's a really good question." And I said, it's important when you're choosing your ghostwriter for you to feel connected to them and for you to feel confident that they will be able to capture your story. Um, and I'll be honest, I'm terrible with accents. I'm not a very good accent actor. I don't try to play British characters. If I do, it's in improv shows where the audience loves that I fail. There's joy in failing. Um, but it's very different, the written word, and I think that this is a really nuanced and unique talent that ghostwriters need to have. And I don't even know how it's taught really. I think it just, I don't know. It depends on your life experience really. But capturing a person's voice on the page is like capturing their essence and seeing them and making them feel seen and kind of holding a wonderful mirror up to them where they see themselves maybe even in a new way, but they feel seen.
That's something, and I bring this example up a lot on here. Just I don't know, because I guess it makes me look good. But I had an encounter one time where, and actually this has happened twice that I can think of, where I'm editing with an author and they are cutting out stuff that I preserved verbatim that they had either written, or it was just, it came out sort of perfect in our interview. So I didn't change a word they said in for a paragraph or something. And they're crossing that out because it doesn't sound like them, or that they don't think it sounds like them. And then the other stuff that I invented based on a mishmash of their thoughts and my writing, they think captures their voice.
It's so tricky, isn't it? And I think even because I have experience with defining, creating, and rolling out tone of voice for companies. So that was part of my kind of not past life, more recent life career, working for companies and defining their collective tone of voice. And it's so fun to get, you'll get founders, CEOs, head people in the company all in one room, and you're trying to pin down what do we think we sound like. And the divergence of opinions is really fun to just kind of sit back and watch because everybody thinks that they should or do sound a certain way. But the reality is, well, what do you want your audience to take away, about you as an individual or as a company? And you need to think about that. And there's a lot of nuance in there.
Um, and one thing I want to get to that in a second, but you brought up the gentleman from London. Um, I mean, that seems to be, Americans who've gone on vacation or something might sort of think they'll hear a difference in accents, but I mean, that really runs deep, the UK English versus US. And then within Britain, my understanding is, I mean, there's so many different accents. People can tell way more about you than from your voice. What is it George Orwell said? Britons are branded on the tongue at birth.
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
versus like in America, I mean, there's some really general stuff, but I mean, like Britain is tiny and there are more accents in London than there probably are in the United States.
It's wild, Charles. So I've lived in the UK. Well, I've lived abroad for almost 20 years now. I'm from the Midwest in America originally. So I'm from Nebraska, and you could drive 8 hours in every direction and everybody will have the same accent within that radius until you get to Chicago, right? Whereas here, when I first moved to the UK, you can drive 50 miles up the road and they have a completely different accent. So it's incredible to me. And of course, how do you write? I think when you're writing, in British English, it'll be about word choice and things like that. You won't hear an accent 50 miles away in a book you're writing, but word choice for sure. There's such a divide here about what you call a bun, or a role, or, I love the kind of nuance between that. There's a lot more to consider here, but in general, the understanding of British English versus US English, there are differences that even after I had lived here for 10 years, in just writing, I was surprised I would learn of new things all the time. You really have to, in order to really understand the differences in writing for the two, I think you have to be immersed in the place for a long time to be able to say that you can capture that.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised, the little work I've done for clients who want something written in UK English, where I thought I knew what I was doing, and there are, yeah, nuances that in writing are totally different from just having spent time on this side of the Atlantic.
Well, this is where a really good line editor at the end can come into play too. Get your community of people.
Absolutely. What brought you to the UK, by the way?
So, oh goodness. So, well, it's quite a story. I'll start with, you kind of asked me to talk about my acting background and the careers I had before that. So this sounds like a good time to talk about that because it's sort of wrapped up in there. Um, so I was an actor from a really young age. I was a professional child actor. I toured nationally in the US. I was out of school. I had tutors. It was really fun. And that was my first love. That's what I wanted to do with my life. So I went to theater school in Nebraska and then moved to Los Angeles in the early 2000s when I was in my early 20s and tried to make a go at that and did so for, I don't know, 5+ years. But it was very difficult. And I realized I had sort of fallen out of love with acting. I was tired of, going out for auditions for blonde toothpaste lover number two, that wasn't where my love began. So I realized I wanted more. And at theater school, I found that my elective courses I was always taking were English literature courses. And obviously storytelling, it's storytelling in a different form. Um, So I went back to university and got my English degree at the University of California and studied abroad in Berlin. And during that time, I met my now husband randomly in an airport, and we were living on opposite ends of the world. And finally decided we needed to live in the same place. So after graduation, we moved to San Francisco together, and that's where I started my journalism career. And after we had been there for a year, I realized I wanted my master's degree in literature. And he's British, so he said, "Well, actually, it'd be really great if we could move to the UK together." So I got my master's degree here, and we were in our 20s. We thought we would move, to Europe, and then we stayed, and we've been here in the UK for 15 years, and we're not going to move because we have children now. But that's what brought me to the UK. Him.
Nice. I was getting, and I mean, that's probably a whole separate podcast, and I bet it could be a really good, sounds like a feature article. You know that there's that meme about like seeing the most like attractive person ever in the airport. And like, but it sounds like you actually went for it. And
It's a wild story. I can tell at a different time, but basically Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan should play us in a movie. We have the best meet cute.
that's brilliant. Um, this, well, there was another thing I wanted to ask about, because like one thing that's come up on this podcast before is bestseller status, because I think it's something a lot of authors say they want or think they want. And um, I think even when it comes to the New York Times, people would be shocked to know how low the threshold could be in a given week to achieve that. And the Sunday Times is, I mean, that my understanding is that that's roughly equivalent to a New York Times bestseller as far as the British book market is concerned.
Yeah, in terms of kind of status in the UK, that's a big one. It's a big deal to have.
And what are the numbers like on that?
Do you know
Like,
what? It really depends. So it depends on a week by week basis, even. So if and I think this is what you're hinting at, is kind of what does that mean, and is that the be all end all for an author? So and I'm no expert here, but from what I understand, um, it depends on when your book is released and how other books are selling that week, and what your book sales have been reported for that week, and for a period of time. So, books that do really well straight out of the gate, and maybe have a lot of pre sales, for example, that boosts your chances of getting a Sunday Times best selling book. But it's so dependent on so many factors, marketing, how well known the author is before the book's even published. There are so many factors that are out of your control, um, that you can never guarantee that a book is going to become a bestseller. And I mean, any ghostwriter who claims that they can write you a bestseller, my personal opinion is run away from them, because it's not about
yes.
it's not about the just the quality of the writing. It's about a lot of other factors that are many of which are out of your control. um, as it happened, the book that I was a best-selling ghostwriter on, it's really funny because the author said, "I didn't think this would do so well," and I was like, I actually did know this one would, because there was such a big demand for this book to be written, and there were people just lining up, who wanted this book. So that was very helpful for this specific book. But you can't guarantee that. You just can't. You can guarantee that as a writer, you will do your very best work, and that the quality of the work will be really good, but you can't control the outcome. Publishers can't. Um, yeah.
No, it's true. And I guess the thing you can do too is that like there are things you can probably do to set yourself up for the best opening you can, but like other than that, um, oh man, now I'm dying to know what the book was. I'll definitely ask when we we hit stop. Um, are there any other kind of observations you've had about the book world generally in the UK versus I mean, I get the impression it's very centralized, much in the same way the US, like that you're basically talking about New York if you're talking about publishing, and in the UK it's London.
Well, I found it what I found really surprising, um, was when working with one of the big 5, I had just assumed that any book that they publish, um, here in the UK would be that they would automatically want to publish in the US. I mean, as long as it wasn't specifically niche to that country. But I had really interesting conversations with the publisher and with the editor that they have no control over it. That basically they'll hand it over to the US division and say, "Here you go. You can take it forward if you want to." But that it's not kind of just assumed, and that I don't know why that was a surprise to me, but it was. I just assumed that, oh, if you're going to publish it in the UK, the US, we're almost the same. Why wouldn't you just automatically do it? But no, they are very different markets with different considerations, and it's not just a given that one will be published in the other place.
Interesting.
Hmm.
And I guess that's another one of those unforeseeables where I'm sure there are things that, I mean, who would have thought that, like, Scandinavian crime novels would be such a popular genre in English? Um,
Exactly. Or there's a big trend of like Japanese novels that were written 10 years ago and were really popular over there, just now becoming popular over here in the UK. I went to, there was one book in particular that I had seen and months later thought, why didn't I buy that book? I'm interested in it. So I went to my local bookshop. I have a lovely one on my road. And I went in and I was like, hey, I want this book. It's I can't remember the name of it or the author of it, but it's a Japanese book, and there's a bunch of books on the cover with like a coffee shop and a cat. And he was like, "Oh my gosh, there's so many of those right now." Those are that genre in particular with cats and books on the cover are so popular. You kind of they're wild trends that happen that you can't predict either.
I mean, you know who is one of the most popular British authors of all time in Japan?
Who?
Beatrix Potter of Peter Rabbit.
Do you know what? I would never have guessed that, but I guess in a way that's not surprising.
There are, yeah, when I was over there, I learned about like tours you can book, from Japan, where part of your itinerary in the UK is to go to her house. There's like Japanese bus tours for that.
Wow, that's wild.
They have, I mean, their culture around their own literary tradition is so magnificent, and I mean, you can become, I think it's like a living national treasure, where they confer this really special status on a person, and I think the enthusiasm of readers, like, we don't really have an equivalent in the West, where I think even the most famous authors get to live pretty anonymous lives.
Mm.
Or the
I do. There is this kind of romantic idea about, or an interesting dichotomy actually, because if you think about writers, we're we have these two very opposing sides, which is, you know, see me, hear me, read me, let me feel seen and validated by putting this important stuff out into the world. But ooh, don't look at me. Don't bother me. And I mean, I personally feel this. I want to be in the limelight, and I also have that other very introverted side that is like, I need to go into a cave and be alone.
I mean, that's like perfect for ghostwriting, right? And you can always kind of be like, who knows who wrote that Sunday Times bestseller? And by the way, it was me. Like,
Exactly. I do enjoy that.
but and that's something that's come up on this podcast before. How if you look up, like, if you're totally new to this and you're trying to learn how to, like, what ghostwriting is or how you could get into it, you'll see comments on places like Reddit where it's like, who would ever do that? And like, it's like, why would you write something and not get credit? And it's so funny to me what that sort of says about the person making that comment and their idea of what would
Yeah.
make someone want to write anything.
I think it's really, yeah, it's really interesting. The On the flip side of that too, I think it's interesting how many people don't understand why a person would use a ghostwriter, and all of the people that I've ghostwritten for are amazing writers in their own right. They could write the book that I helped them write, but they're too busy. They don't have the time. It's a full-time job, and if you already have a full-time job, um, you can't finish it on your own. It's No matter what, I think creating a book and bringing it into the world is a team effort, even if it's a fiction book which you've written yourself. So I just finished my debut fiction novel, which I'm in the process of querying agents for. And I had a developmental editor, I had beta readers, I had a line editor, and I have all of those skills. I can wear all of those hats, but you should never wear all of those hats yourself on one book. It should be passed off. And the joy of ghostwriting and of working with a ghostwriter is that you get to have that team component of creating. Books are a lot of work. It's difficult to do on your own.
And it's true. I mean, I've found that especially with people like CEO type books or whatever. I mean, it I don't think it takes anything away from what we do to say that someone in that position really does have better things to do than fuss over writing. And it's not to say that one thing's more valuable or whatever. It's just that if this isn't actually what, and that's oftentimes, people will say to me like, oh, like, was this person's book ghost written? Was this? And my like rule of thumb is if this person's profession isn't writing books, then they certainly had a collaborator on. Like and because I think there's a really weird and occasionally very sexist or classist assumption that a certain type of famous person would be perfectly capable of writing their own book, and then a certain other type, usually an athlete or a pop star, must have had a ghostwriter.
Hmm.
Where it's like, no, the smart person too. Um, you
Yeah,
know, Especially people like scientists and academics who don't know how to write popular nonfiction. Um,
exactly. Or they're out busy doing science.
mhm.
They're out conducting research. They're promoting their science or their findings. It's the amount of work. I think sometimes with certain clients, the amount of work I need to do to make them understand how much work goes into writing a book. There was one client, for example, who thought that they might do some of the writing on their own and had put aside 4 hours a week to do that. And I had to kind of go through the maths with them. I had to say, okay, if you're writing 1 hour a day, 4 days a week, let's say max you knock out 600 words in that hour. And that's like pretty good going. You got to get into it. Um, that's like 2,400 words a week. A 200-page book is 60,000 words. You do the maths. You're not going to finish that book this year. And it's putting aside that time and all of that. It's a lot.
And it's funny too because you can get that compounding can work in your favor for less time more consistently. Like I would say if their plan was to write an hour every morning before work, they would have their first draft in a year or less. Um, because you can, because that's the other thing too. I think people, again, like, or it's that kind of thing of like, oh, I'll do this when I retire and I have 8 hours a day to write, and it's like nobody writes for 8 hours a day. That's crazy.
No, I'm definitely 4 hours a day is my max, like, writing time. I can do other tasks in the other 4 hours, administrative tasks or research or things like that. But my writing time, I'm I'm productive for 4 hours, and any more than that, and it's going to be counterproductive.
There was something you kind of touched on a minute ago, and I want to get back to it because I think it goes back to that question of like what we mean when we say voice or story. It seems like a lot of these terms get co-opted in a very vague way by brands and corporations, and that you've kind of been on the front lines of that kind of writing and consulting. Um, what do you think? This might I don't mean to make this question sound too loaded, but it seems to me that a lot of brands, like to put it politely, don't know what the fuck they're talking about when they throw the word story around. Like they'll say there's a story around these like whatever this like plug-in or whatever. And it's like there could be, but not like intrinsically. Um,
Yeah.
what's going on there? How come people love that word and then kind of
I have a
bastardize it so much?
yeah, I have a lot of really good views on this because my background, obviously my the beginning of my life was in acting. Then I did an English literature degree. Then I was a journalist for a long time, and then I worked in a marketing department for the first time in my career after having gone through these long stages of storytelling um, jobs. And I think there's a tendency to kind of like revere one form of storytelling and to look down on another. And they are very different. And I uh, definitely did that in the past. And then when I went over to the dark side of marketing, which I'm so glad I did. It's not for me kind of long term, but I'm really glad I did because storytelling is so important. It is how we made sense of the world, how our ancestors sat around fires and told stories, right? And it's a very human thing, and it's an important way of making sense of the world. And I think we get a little bit touchy about using that term when we're talking about selling products, for example, especially products that maybe feel very superficial, right? For example, we might feel a little bit more comfortable if a brand is talking about their story when the brand feels really important and meaningful. So, like an example of that might be, I don't know, maybe something that touches on your health, human health, or something like that. If it's marketing that is trying to incite important change in public health policy, for example, that might feel okay to talk about storytelling. And then we might get really grossed out by like a, I don't know, software as a service brand talking about storytelling, or like, I don't know, something like that. Uh, they are all, they need different different forms of storytelling, and I get why the inclination to kind of go, ugh, you're not allowed to use that term. But there are stories. There's a story behind why somebody needs to optimize their marketing campaigns for that software as a service. And that's actually just, that's important as well. And I think that those forms of writing, when they lean into what is the user journey here? Why is the thing that I'm trying to communicate important to them? And how is it going to make their life better? How am I going to move them from where they are to where they could be? What's the super awesome future version of themselves that my product is going to solve for them? You need to paint that picture, and that is storytelling. And I think the best storytellers are actually, or not the best, but it's a talented storyteller who's able to go into that icky marketing space and make it not feel icky. So when it does feel icky, maybe that marketer hasn't done their job so well.
So yeah, and I guess to clarify what I'm saying, I think I'm referring to when it's half baked or they are claiming they're using the word story to refer to something that isn't storytelling, not necessarily that the subject isn't story worthy or what have you. Having spent some time in that icky place myself, I mean, I think it's great training for a writer because you're right, oftentimes writing things that people are going out of their way to either not read, or in the case of B2B, like sort of skim. Um, and so you kind of have to let go of the idea that anyone's going to see importance in your words for their own sake. Um,
Yeah, I think
but
it's important. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no. That's it. It's just that, yeah, I think where maybe where the ick comes in is when that work isn't done, and it's not there isn't a story that, because I think too it should be kind of obvious, in the same way a lot of brand stuff is communicated without anyone having to spell it out for you. Um,
Yeah. I think it's really interesting because I'm re-listening to have you ever listened to Brandon Sanderson's YouTube writing? This is going to seem like a jump, but it's relevant. Have you listened to any of Brandon Sanderson's writing lectures that he posts on YouTube?
I haven't, but I'm going to write that down now.
Seriously, anyone who's a writer or is interested in writing, I think should listen to these. So Brandon Sanderson, for anyone that doesn't know, is a prolific sci-fi writer. He's one of the regarded as one of the best sci-fi and fantasy writers of our time. He does lectures in the States, and he posts them online, and he posted a whole series of them back in 2020, and he's just now releasing new ones like each week that he's doing in 2025. He talks about, and I'm going to completely misquote this, but he talks about a well-known writer who went into a Reddit forum, and in the Reddit forum they were talking about how you must have a good idea um, before you start writing. Like it's the idea, not the writing. If the idea isn't good, then the writing can't possibly be good. And this famous writer went in and said, "Okay, give me your worst idea." And Reddit gave it to him, and he went off, took that horrible idea, and wrote it into a series that ended up being a bestseller. And it did amazingly well because he was an amazing writer and he can take anything and make it important. And I think that that's what the art of writing and storytelling is, there's a common saying that there's nothing new under the sun. you know, um, Lion King is Hamlet, Dune is Hamlet. There's no new stories. It's how you tell them, and I find that really fascinating because it's a common thread that kind of runs through everything, but everything can be new depending on how you do it. You know?
I like that. It reminds me of that thing. I forget who the poet in question was, but the painter Degas was like trying his hand at poetry, and it didn't work. And he approached his friend who's a poet and was like, "I have all these ideas," and he was like, "Well, we write poems with words. We don't write them with ideas." That's I think something you, I guess, have to be a writer to learn, in some cases the hard way, that like ideas aren't really don't really mean anything on their own. Um,
Yes, exactly.
and so I guess a kind of a more positive spin is like if you were working with, say, a brand where they're at that point where they sort of have an idea but no execution, or they have kind of a image without a story. Like, what does that conversation look like? Is it a question? I mean, how do you find the story in whatever it is they're working with, whether it's the best idea or the worst idea or what have you?
Well, I think it goes back to first principles of writing anyway, which is who is your audience? Who are you writing for? Who are you trying to communicate for? And I think the mistake that, if we're talking about branding and companies, I think the mistake that a lot of them fall into is trying to tell their story. Let me tell you the story of me and why I'm so excellent. But really, you should be flipping it and tell the story of your ideal audience, your ideal customer in the case of a company. How can you put them in the place of where they might be struggling now, and how you can bring them to where they want to be, rather than saying, I'm so excellent. I've created this thing. I've been doing, and you know what? Even though I know this, I sometimes, when I'm selling myself, I sometimes start with, I'm a writer who I have decades of experience and yada, 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 rather than focusing on the person or the company or whatever it might be that I'm reaching out to. Rather than selling yourself, sell the person and how you can help them and how you can move them forward on whatever their journey is.
Nice. And I guess I mean, in a lot of ways, it's the same with readers. The thing I was always told about memoirs is people don't read your memoir to learn about your life. They read it to learn about themselves. Um,
Yes. When you find yourself in a piece of writing, that's when you connect to it.
um, Now, the other kind of life you've lived that seems to have a very clear relevance to ghostwriting is journalism, and it seems to be a place like if I do the maths on the kind of age of some of the ghostwriters I know, I think a lot of people found their way to ghostwriting following the early newspaper layoffs in like 2008 or something when you had the economic downturn plus like blogging taking over. Um, and they were like mid-career journalists at that point. Um, all the kind of career and economic stuff aside, in that very difficult profession, what what about journalism kind of sets you up for ghost, or like what do you use on a daily basis in ghostwriting from journalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, actually, it's funny that you mentioned 2008, 2009, because with my timeline, because I went to university and then was an actor in LA and then went back to university and was kind of an older student. I graduated from my English undergrad in 2009. That's when I entered journalism. So I was very lucky because I kind of fell into it. I mean, it's a bit of a catch 22. And back then it was, my first job was in print. It was for a magazine that reported on the science and technology of solar power. And I think I
Oh
got the
wow.
job. Yeah, I got the job. I knew nothing about that, by the way. I got the job because I spoke German and it was owned by a German company. And they thought, well, this person can communicate with our offices in Berlin. So we'll hire them, even though they have no experience. Um,
Genau.
Again now, yeah. So that was a real education in how to get things right the first time. And this is a stereotype, but because they were German, things had to be exact and efficient and accurate. There was no room for error. It was print. You can't go back and delete it. Um, so that was a real education in listening and getting things right. um, and so I pull from that experience, and then I subsequently went on to become a medical journalist. um, and I pull from my journalism experience. I think the biggest thing I bring into my ghostwriting is the curiosity you have to have when you're a journalist, because you can't just go into a piece with a preconceived notion in black and white how it's going to turn out. If you're doing your job correctly, you're asking questions, you're digging in, you're staying curious, and you're bringing things to the surface that you didn't even know existed. And I find that ghostwriting is very much like that, even for the person I'm ghostwriting for. So sometimes when I sit and, we do a really big interview phase at the beginning, um, I'll pull out things from them that they wouldn't have even thought to include in this part of their life that we're talking about. And I do that by staying curious and kind of asking, what happened then, or what was that like, or how did that make you feel? And I'm trying to like dig down underneath the surface of what they're telling me. And I think that's where my journalism skills really come to the fore with ghostwriting, is that interview phase and being really active, and present when I'm with them, because that time is so important.
it seems to me that there are stakes in journalism and the ethical kind of requirements that produce a lot of really good habits, like you're describing in the way to conduct an interview. Even that curiosity could be, there's like a systematic approach to curiosity where you, I mean, I think most people know it as the five W's and an H. How do you, there's like, it's one of those, the who, what, when, where,
Where,
isn't there
why,
a,
when, how. Who, what,
yeah,
where, why, when, how.
but isn't there a term for that that's like technically wrong? It's like the five W's, but they're not all W or something like that.
I don't know what the term is, but yeah. How doesn't start with a W? Why did
Like
we?
yeah, it's kind of like was it the three like reading, writing, and arithmetic, and um,
They didn't have a good marketing department to package that up correctly.
no. So I guess one thing I want to ask you something that I kind of went to Reddit because I mean I'm one of those people I have just such admiration and respect for journalists and a real inferiority complex about like having clips that are old. Um, and like I recently went through I'm now a member of the ASJA, and even though I met their requirements with it's like something like 10 national clips or one book, and I had kind of both of those things, but the age of the clips made me feel like such an imposter because like any self-respecting journalist would have had clips in the last few weeks or months. um, but for those of us who maybe are not going to actually be journalists by trade but need to use those skills on the job, whether we're ghostwriters or writers of nonfiction or even a lot of it sounds to me like a lot of the long form B2B copywriting that you describe or brand consulting. I mean, that requires similar skills. What are some ways that people could like learn those short of a journalism degree or something like that? Are there any good books people could read?
Oh gosh. I did read and I don't actually read a lot of books of that sort, but I did recently read the Jobs to Be Done book. I don't know if that's the title of it actually. I'm very bad with remembering titles. That one was good because it talked about focusing on the person more than yourself. Um, Beyond books, this is going to sound maybe a little bit wacky, but I would suggest it for anybody who wants to be a writer. Or even if you don't want to be a writer, even if you want to be more attuned to actively listening in your life, I would suggest you go out to your local improv company and sign up for an improv class because that is a masterclass in learning to be in the moment and to listen to the person across from you rather than listening to reply, like listening, properly listening. And that is a skill that can only be taught through experience, I think. Um, so sign up for an improv class. That's what I would say.
There seems to be an element in interviews. I mean, I've been doing it in this one where you kind of go where there's an improv term for this, but you sort of go where things are. You let the scene unfold in a certain way or something like that.
Yeah, it's yes and.
Yes, right, sure, yeah, yes, and there seems to be a lot of that because I think a really bad interview, it isn't even so much a question of listening or listening to talk ratio. I mean, hopefully those things are squared away, but otherwise, really bright people who interview badly, I think, stick to rigid questions and they try to like wedge them into a conversation that isn't even about the thing that they started on.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. If you're not being flexible, I mean, that's the thing that we say. So I'm in an improv group here in Bristol where I live, and we do long form scenes. And if you have a preconceived notion about how a scene is going to go, and you stick to that and you don't adapt and stay flexible with the other people you're on stage with, it's going to absolutely kill the scene. because you're not going to be moving and unfolding in the way that is happening in front of you. You'd end up blocking your scene partners. So if, for example, they offer you a suggestion and you block it and don't say yes and you say, well, no, actually, I was going to do this, it just kills the scene and it kills the vibe, you know? So that ability to stay flexible and to adapt based on what's in front of you is really powerful.
And they're really, I mean, to a person, anyone I've ever interviewed, whether it's for this or for a ghostwriting author, there's always something that is more interesting than what they have originally put out there about themselves. That's kind of lurking, and you have to, yeah, you've got to be ready when that comes up.
And I think those are the gems. Those really unexpected things that are unexpected for you as the ghostwriter, that are unexpected for them as the teller of the story. You know, those I think that's where the magic happens.
Totally. Um, there was something else that you had mentioned about your own journey, and that was, and I think there's just like so many people who right now are going through this and probably need some help. You made the leap from an in-house role to totally freelance, and I think that's a very scary move, and one that some people are having to make, not really even by choice. Any advice to offer there?
Yeah, it is scary. It's definitely scary. For me, I was lucky in that it the timing was really right for me. I'm going to give some really like practical, actionable tips, I think, because I think that'll be helpful. But just a little bit of backstory. For me, it felt like the timing was right. I had gone through these different stages of my career that we've discussed. And I had reached a really tipping off point where I've acquired all of these very diverse skills. And I've I had built up a network and I felt like it was the time that I could make that leap. And so for me, I had kind of planned it, and I had squirreled away some money. And so, my first tip, if you can, is try to squirrel away some money so that you can work for some certain amount of time, um, or not work, sorry, for a certain amount of time, and know that financially you're going to be okay. That makes the world of difference because then you're not taking jobs on as an act of desperation. Also, there's a big power in being able to say no. You know, so if you have that chunk of money squirreled away, you can feel confident to say no to a potential client that you don't think is right for you or that you're not right for. It means you're doing your best work. It means that you can stick to what your rates are and you're not kind of running around doing a lot of work for a small rate just because you feel desperate and that you need it. So that's not necessarily doable in all circumstances, but if you can plan for that, I would do that. I had 6 months saved up before I made that leap, and that was what was made it comfortable enough for me to be able to make that leap. Um, the other bit of advice I would give is your network is more fruitful than you can imagine it to be. Um, I, I, I've just made a point of posting on LinkedIn. I started off by just doing it once every week. That's all I did, once a week. Now I just do twice a week. I know people who post on LinkedIn every single day. Um, I don't have the bandwidth or desire to do that. Right now, I'm just enjoying it. And so that feels right to me. But I would say, as much as you can network, and whatever that term means to you, do that because there are people that have come to me. A lot of the work I've gotten actually has been through connections of mine, either somebody who knows me, or somebody I worked with 15 years ago. I have a call tomorrow with somebody who actually messaged me and said, "Get out of my LinkedIn feed. But seriously, can I talk about hiring you?" um,
Nice.
and so, and don't feel embarrassed. Try not to feel embarrassed about putting yourself out there. Um, be brave and be bold and do what brings you joy. If something isn't bringing you joy, if you don't like posting on LinkedIn 5 days a week, don't do it because it's just going to feel icky. Do what makes you happy, and yeah, and hold your nerve is, I guess, the final thing that I find really difficult sometimes. Something I'm just loving about freelance life is the dopamine and excitement I get about the chase. And I also, we haven't even talked about this, but in high school, I worked in sales. And so I know about, it's a numbers game and you have to kind of hold your nerves. Sometimes you can feel on top of the world and it's amazing. And other times you just feel a little bit drained. So you've got to kind of hold your nerve and make sure that you're making space for yourself and that you're switching off and you have good boundaries. Um, yeah,
That's
I hope
great.
that's helpful.
No, I think I definitely, and I can relate about the dopamine thing. I've heard it compared to like base jumping before, and it's like because I know some people who would be great freelancers and they have skills that are totally underused because they're in a very safe kind of 9 to 5 role, but they just don't, that nerve you described, they don't want to have to test that. Whereas, um, I don't know, I yeah, it's weird. It's tough. We had someone on here who does some. She's like a adventurer and kind of chronicler of risk, and she was like, "But I think freelancing is pretty risky."
It is. It's risky, but also exciting. Like, I've never felt more alive. So it is
Yes,
like base jumping. I feel so
right.
alive.
Yeah, and I guess anybody who objects to like the ground rushing up at you, or your dwindling bank account is really kind of missing what's in it for the person who who
Yeah,
likes it.
I would say it's not for everybody. Definitely, I know lots of people that it wouldn't be the right lifestyle for them. For me, it feels great right now. So I'll keep going as long as I'm happy.
Brilliant. I think that's a great policy. Well, Marie, I'm gonna have to have you back on for a mini episode about fiction because I had a bunch of questions about that we didn't even get to. But thank you so much. Where can people find you if they want to work with you or learn about your work?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn. My name's Marie Ellis, Ellis. Or you can go to my website, which is musecontent.co.uk. Um, I'm also on Instagram as Amused Marie if you want to see the kind of more improv actor side of me.
Nice, and that's Muse, Muse, like invoking the muse.
Like the muse, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me, and I would love to come back and talk about fiction next time.
Let's do it. If you have an epic story, I'd love to hear it. You can find me at dailyprose.com or on LinkedIn. My links and Marie's are in the show notes. Thanks for listening.